Hello, everyone, and welcome to AGO from Home, our new digital platform. Thank you for joining us this evening, presumably from your home, where we hope you are well and safe. My name is Bojana Stančić, and I'm the Assistant Curator, Live Projects and Performance at the Art Gallery of Ontario. Now, even though we may be meeting in the virtual world, I would still like to acknowledge that the Art Gallery of Ontario operates on land that is the territory of the Anishinaabe and Mississauga Nation, and was also the territory of the Wendat and Haudenosaunee. The Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This Friday's time slot has been conceived as a combination of archival memories and programs that are looking into the future of arts and creativity that will inevitably persist through the current circumstances, unprecedented as they are. So today we inaugurate the Home Stage program. We titled it Home Stage to allude not necessarily to the limitations of digital performance, but the opportunity to revisit the nascent performative impulse, where home stage is maybe the first stage we knew. Limitless, earnest, vulnerable, and poignant. Also a few adjectives associated with our guest today, which is a perfect way to welcome Memory Pearl. So who or what is Memory Pearl? It is the new moniker of Moshe Fisher-Rozenberg. Moshe has had a long history within the Toronto music scene, both as a consummate collaborator with bands like Always, Effed Up, US Girls. Two of these are Polaris Music Prize winners and played AGO First Thursdays, as well as Youth Lagoon and Man Forever. Up until now, he has been best known as drummer and synthesist in Absolutely Free. As a civilian, Moshe is completing graduate work in music therapy after 2 years of leading music therapy sessions at Toronto Centre for Addiction and Mental Health. This album we're celebrating today, Music for Seven Paintings, is his first solo record, and we are so grateful for having you share and launch it with us today. Just a bit of background for the album itself. Music for Seven Paintings is literally an album of 7 songs for 7 paintings. And it was particularly relevant to us as visual art is what we do at the AGO. And because 2 of the 7 paintings Moshe dedicates songs to are in our collection. Natural Answer by Helen Frankenthaler and Franz Kline's Cupola. So despite not being able to visit them in person during this COVID era, we are so excited, as I think Moshe was too, to let his sonic landscapes guide us through the visual gestures of these greats of 20th century abstract art. And finally, to the program itself. In a few moments, Moshe will conjure sounds from the record, but first he will engage in a dialogue with our esteemed Associate Curator of Modern Art, Kenneth Brumal, whose own passion for this time period in art history has touched many, and to whom we are so grateful to be able to join us today. Kenneth, thank you again for being part of this.
Thank you, Bojana. Thank you, Moshe. I hope you are both well. And it's a pleasure, Moshe, to meet you. I've had the pleasure to listen to your compositions recently, and I do have a few questions. I hope you're willing to answer them. The first is, your compositions, our audience should know, accompany films that ostensibly assume the viewpoint of the paintings you have cited as your sources of inspiration. To begin, let us view the first 30 seconds of your film entitled Sunflower 1969, whose soundtrack is your musical response to Joan Mitchell's eponymous painting at the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
Sure.
Now, we should show our audience a reproduction of Joan Mitchell's painting. Again, it is entitled Sunflower of 1969. And my question to you, Moshe, in the film, why did you employ a fade-in at the beginning? Were you trying to evoke the lambency warmth with which Mitchell's painting envelops her viewers, its viewers, excuse me. And yes, if we can move to the slide where we can view the painting, just so our audience has a sense of what the painting looks like and they can maybe relate it to Moshe's film.
So Kenneth, thank you for your question. Basically, when making, it's funny that I really am flattered that you're calling them films, because we kind of, you and I kind of exist in two different worlds. You're from the visual arts world, and I'm from like the music world. And so to me, they're music videos, but like in my fantasies, they're referred to as films. So I really appreciate your choice of language. But as for the fade-in, I mean, basically, I worked with the filmmaker Michael Pivar, and we kind of went back and forth. The videos are very subtle, so there aren't so many opportunities. It's like the choices are subtle. No matter what you do, the choices are subtle. But absolutely, I forget the words you used to describe the painting, but yes, essentially like the beauty, the grace, the ease, and kind of like the ethereal qualities of the Mitchell painting definitely informed that fade-in. It felt like every choice surrounding the music and as well as the video had to have that grace. So something as simple as a fade-in made perfect sense because you're sort of easing into it. It's not so jarring. Yeah, and it seemed to suit the painting in that way, yeah.
The reason I ask, a few years ago at the Art Gallery of Ontario, we staged an exhibition on the paintings of Joan Mitchell and Jean-Paul Riopelle. And the Joan Mitchell paintings, as you can see in this reproduction, you have these modeled shapes that are suspended on these white grounds. And especially with the predominance of the canary yellow that one sees in a canvas, when you stand in front of these works, what almost begins to occur is you feel the warmth and the light that the painting generates envelop you. And for me, what was most salient when I first watched the video was how the fade-in almost evokes that dissemination of light onto the spectator. And this is why I ask, because my experience of these canvases is one in which light almost falls onto my body, and then I become enveloped by the painting. And for me, the fade-in as a device, as a filmic device, seemed to evoke that illusion of being bathed in the painting's warmth. And this is why I felt maybe perhaps you use that device, because this is how I experienced Joan Mitchell's paintings.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, I'd never be able to put it as eloquently, but that's exactly it. And just to add to that, the choice of actor in the video is my wife, and it felt like I was giving this piece special treatment. And that warmth and that light is a big part of it. It was kind of like I needed to, or I didn't have to do anything, but I wanted to choose an actor that was very, very tender to me, somebody who provides me with that kind of warmth and that kind of light, just as a little bit of VH1 pop-up video background information.
Did Mitchell's pigments inspire the colors of your wife or the film spectator's costume elements?
Yes, like 100%. And it's like I've been making music for so long and creating content for so long, and I'm always trying to throw in subtleties like that, and no one has ever really confronted me with them. So like in my mind, that's like an Easter egg. You know, I kind of didn't expect people to necessarily pick up on that, but yeah, absolutely. We made 3 of these videos or films, and in each one, the actors are, yeah, they're exuding the same palette as the paintings. I basically just like sent a photo of the painting to each of the actors and said, dress like this.
Huh. This is interesting because for me, when I view the film, so you're creating a film that assumes the viewpoint of a painting, that observes the movements of a viewer whose costume elements appear to be a product of the work of art they're beholding.
Mm-hmm.
Doing that, you seem to be exploring how the formal elements of a painting structure viewers' aesthetic responses. And I wonder, have you ever read Wolfgang Iser's The Implied Reader?
I haven't read that book, but I find that observation very interesting. I don't know if that was my intention, but I find that observation very interesting. I can tell you a little bit about why there was that choice to have the actors dressed in a way that kind of mirrors the paintings. And mostly that was to kind of like convey the painting's influence on that person, you know? And also to like kind of more literally sort of like illustrate that there is a relationship there, there is a connection there between the person viewing a painting and the painting itself. You know, they're matchy. They're twins in that moment.
I mean, this is why I mentioned Wolfgang Iser. In 1972, he published a text entitled The Implied Reader, and what he wanted to track was how the novel from its genesis through the 20th century, how its structure, how literary structure also structured a reader's experience. And he, using literary hermeneutics, he wanted to show how a reader's experience of a text was informed by how that text was written. And in the 20th century, he makes the argument that as novels become more abstract, what they do is they create a scenario wherein the reader is launched on a trajectory of discovery that ultimately leads them to have an aesthetic response that challenges all of their presuppositions. And when I'm looking at your video and I see how the camera is focused on a spectator whose body and whose clothing is informed by the formal structure of the work, but then you see them fidgeting, their eyes wandering, and you begin to see that they're relating to this abstract matrix that's helping them embark on a trajectory of discovery. This is why I mentioned Iser, because the way Iser describes the structure of the 20th century novel and the reader response, it seems that you're exploring something similar, but in film in relation to painting, but also embedding it in the sonic environment of music. And this is why I invoke Iser, because it seemed to me that if one were to mobilize a theoretical text to explain what you were doing, it just seems that reader response theory out of Germany in the 70s would be the most apposite.
I'm into that, and I'm going to put that on my reading list. And it's kind of interesting too to think about that in the context of abstract images and abstract paintings too, because I'm sure there's a tie-in somewhere. But what you're describing kind of makes me think about how that structure or lack of structure, if that's how you want to interpret it, just like allows a lot of wiggle room for a person to explore, for a person to poke around. And that, for me, was sort of like at the forefront of these videos, was just the idea that like somebody is focused on a fixed image, but there's so much going on inside them. I mean, they're time traveling, thinking about the past, thinking about the future, thinking about their feelings. There's just, and that, you know, that comes from a very personal place, because that's how, that was my experience of the paintings, was they just were so generous in giving me so much room to like insert my narrative, you know?
No, no, it makes perfect sense, and thank you. I have another question, but before we explore it, let us listen to the first 60 seconds of your musical composition entitled Natural Answer.
Sure.
Please describe this opening movement to our audience.
Oh, this opening movement. This is the first track from the record. And, you know, just like I'm trying to do with all of the works, I'm just trying to distill my experience of the painting. So this is Helen Frankenthaler's Natural Answer painting from your collection, from the AGS collection.
Yes, we had it on display a few years ago, and I know we have a reproduction of it here.
So I remember it really vividly. I was really just wandering around the gallery like a bug, you know, looking for a light to flock toward. And I remember seeing it, and it felt really like the sky opened up and it like washed over me. And so the music is a reflection of not just the painting, but also, you know, the thoughts and the feelings and the memories and the ideas that it brought out in me as I was experiencing the artwork. And in that introduction, I'm really, and again, like I said, it's the first track on the record, so I'm really just trying to set a scene. And to me, that scene, which is that Frankenthaler painting, is a very ethereal landscape with like a very ambiguous mood. So that's kind of what I'm going for. And I'm using basically layers of synthesizers, and they're oscillating between very airy and fluid elements, and also very forceful and powerful and self-assured elements of that landscape, of that ethereal landscape. I'm also using some sequenced rhythmic patterns to kind of illustrate that like back and forth, that horizontal back and forth movement of the brush strokes, which are very prominent in the painting.
Yes, I mean, what we say is it's almost as if she were painting this painting is made of horizontal slabs, and she's stacking these slabs and almost in two columns on the canvas. And
yeah.
Most salient for me when listening to the opening movement of Natural Answer, how the staccato notes at the beginning seem to correspond with what appear to be distinct horizontal strokes on this canvas. But then those notes, they become increasingly blurred and they begin to meld into one another. And for me, it's very similar to one's perceptual experience of this picture, where one first sees the two columns of horizontal slabs, but then they begin to blend into one another. And eventually what forms before the eyes is this terracotta plenum. And there's a similar trajectory in the opening movement of your composition where the notes are staccato, but then they begin to blend into one another. And this is the correspondence I was able to draw between your composition and the canvas.
It's kind of like blowing my mind to hear you talk about columns, because that's the word that popped into my head actually years ago when I was writing in my notebook, experiencing this painting. I couldn't stop thinking about columns. And it's weird that you would use that terminology as well. And yeah, I don't know. I'm glad that you chose this one in particular, because there are other pieces, there are other compositions on the record that are a little bit less literal, but I feel like this one is actually, the music actually matches the painting quite a bit.
Yeah, no, the correspondence is remarkable. And if I might ask just one more question,
sure,
before you perform. The author of the essay on your album's jacket mentions how the formal experiments of the 20th century avant-garde have been tamed by a capitalist culture that has reduced it to so much background decoration. And to illustrate this point, let us look at this photograph that was published in the March 1951 issue of Vogue, where Jackson Pollock's Autumn Rhythm was used as a backdrop in a fashion advertisement. And in art history, we describe this co-optation of avant-garde experimentation into commodified forms of the culture industry as the transformation of painting into what we call apocalyptic wallpaper. So you can imagine the radicality of painterly forms then being reduced to a decorative backdrop that serves as the ground for the commodification of women and clothing. And I wonder, in music, many people, especially Theodore Adorno, have argued that there's also been a reification of music. And I'm wondering, what are your opinions about the reification of music and listening and the commodification of avant-garde music? And do you feel that your practice in any way addresses that problem?
It's a very interesting question. I hadn't actually thought about it until Nick Storing wrote it. I'd asked him to write a little bit about the record, and he brought that up. And that's when I really started to think about it. Before I talk about my feelings about it in the music universe, when I think about it in the art world, I find it's pretty depressing. Like, I've literally been to a Taco Bell that had like Basquiat aesthetic paintings in it. And like,
it's funny you say depressing because, some art historians would argue that the more radical the practice, the more it lends itself to co-optation.
Interesting.
In the case of Jackson Pollock here, meaning he paints Autumn Rhythm in 1950, and less than a year later, it's already reduced to the backdrop of commodification. Yes, it is depressing, but I think that's also the plight of the avant-garde under late capitalism.
I guess, like, in a way, it's making me think about how the more like iconic a person is, the more likely they are to become a Halloween costume or something like that. So it's like a success, but it's also I'm gonna stand by saying it's also a little depressing. But in terms of how how that might what my feelings might be in terms of like avant-garde music having that same trajectory, it's less depressing to me for some reason. I mean, like, I'm making kind of avant-garde ambient music, so I'm really playing with fire, because this is something that some people might deem just totally background music.
Or decorative, yes.
Yeah, decorative or background. But I also still feel like we're pretty far away from like Club Monaco pumping ambient music, like maybe 5 years ago, 5 years away. But to be honest, I'm no stranger to making music that is like hard to ignore. You know, a lot of the music I've made in my career is very like listen to me and pay attention to me. And if you put this music on in the background of your party, like no one's going to be able to carry a conversation because it's very like aggressive and unignorable. But to be perfectly honest, the music that I'm making now is, I'm actually trying to ride the line. I'm trying to, I do try to think a little bit about people's relationship with music. You know, like how many Spotify playlists are there for students who want to study, right? Like they want to read their books while there's music happening and they're not paying attention to that music, but it's keeping them awake or something.
Well, even the delivery, I mean, you're right, even the delivery, when you would think before you published an album, you have created an album, and the expectation is that your listener would enjoy the album in its entirety. Yeah. But in this age of Apple Music, in this age of digitized music, the album has been fragmented into consumable sound bites, and no longer is one forced to experience an album in its entirety and enjoy what would be called the transportation that an album, how it would transport the listener into a different world. And now everything is fragmented into consumable bits. And I think it's created a bit of a crisis for music.
I hear you. I mean, like for me, the ideal situation is, and this is when I finished my record, but it, wasn't ready to be made public. I sent the record to my brother, and he was on like a solo train trip throughout Canada, and he was listening to it. I mean, yeah, that's what I want. I want to make music for people to, go on like a reflective, contemplative journey with the music, I do want it to transport them somewhere. But at the same time, I think that you kind of have to get real and think about people's relationship with music. So at this point, my intention is to make music that actually can simply paint the walls of your room while you're doing something else. Or you could maybe listen to it more actively, and there are rewards to be had. But to try to make music with that duality, I think, is a really great challenge. And it's also just a little bit of a reality check, right? Because that is how people consume music.
It's interesting you say this, because in the 1950s and 60s, Roland Barthes, knowing that people would only read while commuting to work, would purposefully wrote essays the length of a bus ride or a train ride, knowing that that was the attention span of a reader in 1950s, 1960s France. And I think that, yes, I think someone who is at least responding to social constraints and to, I guess, let's just say their horizon, certainly in order to intervene within that condition of fragmented listening, of distracted living, in order to make a musical intervention, one will have to accept that constraint and structure the composition accordingly. So I think on that note, all of us are really excited to hear your three compositions, and we'll welcome Boyana back. And thank you, Boyana, for the invitation. It was a pleasure meeting you, Moshe, and I look forward to seeing both of you at another time. Enjoy the evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. What an amazing conversation. I mean, like the goal of any program, at least, according to me, is sort of the ability to drift from formal analysis, which is guided by curiosity, and then excitement about new sort of discoveries, and of course, late capitalism. So thank you both so much for being able to dip across all of those territories. Moshe, just one thing that I might have neglected to mention before, one of the advantages of being on Facebook Live is also that our audiences can pose questions to you. So I invite them to do so now, just because I haven't had a chance to do it before. So please share on the Facebook thread any questions that you may have. I'll ensure to bring it back up after the performance. And now, super happy to pass it over to Moshe and actually hear the album. Just a quick kind of note, from what I understand, we're about to hear, we started this kind of sonic journey with Franz Kline's Cupola, which then dips into Jackson Pollock's number 28 and extends into Helen Frankenthaler's Natural Answer. Is that a fair thing to say?
Very fair.
And one last comment, how, Moshe, would you recommend the audiences to come on board here? Eyes closed, volume full, painting the walls, as you say?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just happy for anybody to connect with the music in whatever way works for them. If you want to get real deep, go for it. If you want to chop your onions, that's okay too.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I'm going to be back after the performance, and yeah, please enjoy. Thank you, Moshe. I'm not sure how to express applause in the digital space, but that was amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it was beautiful. I personally did definitely drift away. The sun has just barely come out, sort of like where I'm at. So it just felt such a perfect opportunity to kind of doze off, but also like never not engaged.
Great.
Thank you. That was so incredible.
Thank you.
Um, I also like am super happy to report that we do have questions from our audiences. So maybe this is an opportunity to pose a few myself,
Sure.
even though I don't, the Kenneth conversation was pretty exceptional. So first question by Mark Rico. How did you approach the structural differences in the two mediums? The openness of the painting space versus the linear progression of a song?
I kind of, I'm not a purist. So, you know, my intention was never to create like the perfect, like I wasn't trying to, like if the painting is water, I wasn't trying to create an ice cube, you know? So at a certain point, you have to just submit to the creative process and accept that things happen beneath the surface. Things happen subconsciously. So I wasn't really too concerned about it, to be honest. I like that question because it makes me feel good about what I've done. But I think I just embrace the limitation is kind of like the simple way of putting it.
Yeah, because it strikes me sort of, again, gleaning from the conversation with Kenneth, that each of these sort of genres of making and performance in art have their own sort of like special language and potential.
Yeah.
So to sort of so literally translate actually is maybe not cluing into the uniqueness of each. So that makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Also, I think I would drive myself crazy if I was trying to be accurate about anything. Uh,
It's a very artistic thing to say. And we love artists because of that. The second question is maybe is from one of our staff, and actually, like always, when staff is sort of so deeply engaged, like it's a massive compliment to the program as well. And the question is, what and who are your music or sonic rather influences? You can choose sonic or music either way.
um, I'm kind of all over the place, but I'll speak to this Memory Pearl project because I don't hear a lot of like Senegalese funk in what I'm doing. Like that's an influence on me, but not with this project, is what I'm trying to say. Um, um, I'm a big fan of David Behrman. This is somebody who made a record called On the Other Ocean, where he created a computer algorithm that then would respond to some flute playing. So it was kind of a collaboration between a human flute player and like an AI synth. And that record is such a big influence on me. So that's a big name. Also, you know, Laurie Spiegel is a very big, this might be very boring to some people, but maybe the music heads will enjoy it. She's a big influence. And also, there's an artist named Wolfgang Voigt, and his project is called Gas, G-A-S. And I think what I really love about his music is that his best records don't do anything. They don't really go anywhere. There's not really even a story being told. It's kind of a photograph of, yeah, kind of it's kind of a painting, to be honest. It's kind of this, it makes me think of the still image, but the music is like 50 minutes long and nothing happens. And that's something I could never do because my brain is just not wired in that way. I'm a little zany, but I tried my best. A lot of the more vaporous kind of elements in my music, you know, the kind of more washed out elements are definitely coming from Wolfgang Voigt.
I also have to admit how much I enjoy sort of your vocabulary in terms of describing what is probably, a music head kind of like geek approach, but in such sort of embodied language like vaporous, like it's just so beautiful. And I totally get it, it's as an embodied sort of word, like you really do just immediately react to it. So yeah, that's perfect. And why don't we take one more question? And I think
Sure.
here's a question from Matt King, who asks, why, do you know Matt King?
Mm-hmm. I do. Yeah.
I think I do too. The question is as follows. Why did you choose particularly post-war American abstract expressionists? And what was your process in selecting the individual works that you were responding to?
Great question. I'm very proud to say that I tried to keep my process pure. I didn't overanalyze, and I didn't do too much research. I essentially went to a bunch of galleries, whatever galleries I could afford to go to, right? So the AGO is in my hometown, so I can afford that. And then I could afford going to New York for an epic art trip and going to as many galleries as I could. So essentially, I just would go to galleries and I would wander around until I was struck by painting. Whether it's post-war or pre-war wasn't particularly relevant for me and my process. I think I just generally gravitate toward abstract work because it seems like it doesn't insult the audience. It doesn't spoon feed things. It kind of assumes that you have an imagination and you can fill in the blanks. So that's kind of how painting selection went down. And I feel good about it. I mean, I'm essentially just a very pedestrian art lover. I couldn't speak about, I couldn't get too deep about art history, but I can speak in very colorful language about how meaningful a work might be to me and what it brings out in me.
It's so interesting because I think outside of something like performance, abstract art is one of the most difficult for people to sort of engage with and grasp. And even with this program today, I was having a conversation with Kenneth whether or not your interview with him would be before or after the performance, just to kind of heighten senses and give context and sort of, hold your hand along the way. But I think it's so interesting that you have not even considered it. And I mean, to be honest, sort of engaging Kenneth has been such a sort of revelatory moment just for me, and it seems for you too. So it's so interesting that you're like, yeah, this is sort of what I was drawn to, because you need imagination. And for some people, that's a really alienating kind of experience, to not know how to attach the language or access it in a different way.
You know what you're saying kind of reminds me of, I was listening to a talk by someone named Mark Mayer. I don't know if you know him.
Mm-hmm. Former director of the National Gallery.
Yeah. He was giving a talk at MoCA, and I remember him talking about, and this is very recently that I listened to this talk. So it didn't really have any influence on my process or the project, but it's more of an after the fact, I could really jive with what he was saying. Mm. And he was just essentially saying how art is just a match that lights a fire in somebody, right? It kind of like, or, it kind of just puts forth a process in a person's mind. And I think that's what I was going for, and that's what I love about art. I can't really talk too much about, I think Kenneth was talking about the formal elements of art. I'm just not that person. But what I can talk about is, the kind of fire that a painting might light within my mind and within my my affect, my emotions. So that's kind of more my focus in terms of process.
Beautiful. Moshe, thank you so much. I think I leave it on that note, but I really want to ensure that I thanked not just you, but also Kenneth for that invigorating talk and for being part of this. I also definitely want to end up by giving a shout out to Alex Durlach, co-founder of Idefix, our favorite local record label, it's a mouthful, that has been around since 2011 and on whose website you can now officially get Memory Pearl's record. The appropriate links are all on our website, as well as to my colleagues, Devyani Salzman and Ian Solway, who have been supporting us in this from the back end. So thank you so much to all of you and to everybody watching. Enjoy your weekend and we'll see you next Friday. Super grateful. Thank you for that experience.
Thank you.